The cruelest part of betrayal is that it never arrives wearing the face of a stranger. It always looks like someone you once trusted. The chandeliers above the Crystal Garden restaurant covered the entire room in warm golden light, turning polished glass and silver into something that looked almost magical. It was the kind of place where powerful people celebrated victories and wealthy couples promised forever. 3 years earlier, Danielle Brooks had believed she would spend the rest of her life sitting across the table from the man she loved. Tonight, fate had written a very different story. Ryan Whitmore leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed he had won everything. His expensive navy suit matched the luxury around him, and beside him sat Vanessa Collins, the woman who had entered his life long before his marriage had ended. She laughed softly as she reached for her glass, completely comfortable in the life she had helped create. Ryan glanced around the crowded restaurant, enjoying the attention that always seemed to follow success. The new business contract he had signed that afternoon was worth millions of dollars, and for the first time in a long while, he felt certain that every decision he had made had been the right one. Vanessa smiled at him. "You seem distracted." Ryan shook his head. "I was just thinking about how strange life is. Sometimes you have to leave the past behind if you want something better." She reached for his hand. "And do you regret anything?" He looked at her and answered without hesitation. "Not anymore." At that exact moment, the large entrance doors slowly opened. Conversations around the room softened for just a second as a tall man wearing a perfectly tailored black suit stepped inside. Even before anyone recognized him, there was something about the quiet confidence in the way he carried himself that drew every eye in the room. A whisper moved from one table to another. Alexander Hayes, the billionaire whose name appeared on magazine covers and charity foundations across the country. Ryan straightened slightly in his seat. He had never met Alexander personally, but everyone in New York knew who he was. Men spent years trying to earn his respect. Companies competed for a single meeting with him. Vanessa adjusted her dress and smiled. Imagine having a life like that. But Alexander was not alone. A woman walked beside him, her graceful cream-colored dress simple compared to the luxury surrounding her. She did not wear extravagant jewelry. She did not seek attention. Yet somehow the entire room seemed quieter the moment she entered. Ryan's smile slowly disappeared. His heart began to pound so hard that he could hear it over the music. Danielle, the woman he had once called ordinary. The woman he had convinced himself he had outgrown. 3 years had changed her, but not in the way he expected. There was peace in her eyes now. There was confidence in the way she walked. She looked like someone who had survived a storm and discovered that the sunlight was even more beautiful than she remembered. Danielle did not notice him at first. Alexander gently pulled out her chair at a table only a few feet away from Ryan and Vanessa. The billionaire looked at her with quiet admiration, the kind that could never be purchased or pretended. Ryan felt something inside him shift. He had spent years telling himself that Danielle would never find a better life without him. Yet here she was, sitting beside a man the entire city respected. Vanessa followed his stare and frowned. "Ryan, is that your ex-wife?" He could not answer. Across the room, Alexander reached for Danielle's hand with a soft smile. And for the first time since signing the divorce papers, Ryan Whitmore realized that the story he thought had ended was only just beginning. Ryan could not pull his eyes away from the woman sitting across the room. The music, the conversations, and the sound of glasses touching seemed to disappear as though someone had quietly stolen the world around him. Danielle was smiling at something Alexander Hayes had just said, and that simple smile carried him back to a different night, long before expensive restaurants and million-dollar contracts had become part of his life. 3 years earlier, they had lived in a small apartment above a family-owned bakery in Brooklyn. The building was old, and the heater barely worked during the winter, but Danielle had always found ways to make it feel like home. She would light inexpensive candles, cook dinner after working long hours, and leave little handwritten notes beside Ryan's coffee every morning. "Believe in yourself. You are closer than you think." Ryan had kept every one of those notes, although he had forgotten where he placed them. Back then, success was only a dream. He worked endless hours trying to build his consulting business, while Danielle carried most of the weight of their ordinary life. She worked at a neighborhood bookstore during the day and took evening shifts helping with community literacy programs because they needed the extra money. More than once, Ryan told her to quit one of the jobs. She always smiled and answered the same way. One day you will have everything you ever dreamed about. Until then, we carry it together. Danielle never complained when he missed birthdays, anniversaries, or quiet evenings at home because another business meeting seemed more important. She would wait for him with dinner, sometimes falling asleep on the couch before he arrived. Ryan often woke her gently and apologized. She always forgave him before he even finished speaking. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Ryan came home discouraged after another investor rejected his proposal. He sat silently at the kitchen table, convinced his dream would never happen. Danielle disappeared into the bedroom and returned carrying a small wooden box. Inside was the necklace her grandmother had left her, the only valuable thing she owned. Ryan looked at her in surprise. "What are you doing?" She placed the box in his hands. "Sell it." He immediately shook his head. "Absolutely not." Danielle smiled softly. "Jewelry can be replaced. Dreams cannot." Ryan refused, but 2 days later he discovered that she had already sold it. The money covered the final expenses he needed to keep his company alive. He promised her that one day he would repay every sacrifice she had made. Danielle simply wrapped her arms around him and whispered, "Seeing you happy will always be enough for me." The business slowly began to grow. Ryan started attending meetings in Manhattan, wearing better suits and shaking hands with people whose names appeared in financial magazines. Danielle remained exactly the same. She still volunteered on weekends. She still brought homemade lunches to his office because she worried he worked too hard. She still believed that kindness mattered more than status. As Ryan entered a different world, however, he began noticing how different they looked together. Wealthy executives arrived with glamorous partners wearing designer clothes, while Danielle preferred simple dresses and quiet conversations. Some people looked past her without even learning her name. At first, Ryan defended her. Then he started asking her to stay home from certain events. Danielle never argued. She only smiled sadly and told him she understood. Sitting inside the Crystal Garden restaurant, Ryan watched Alexander pull out Danielle's chair with genuine respect, and a memory struck him harder than he expected. Years ago, she had looked at him with exactly the same peaceful smile. It was the smile of a woman who believed love was not measured by money or success, but by the way two people stood beside each other when life was difficult. Ryan slowly lowered his eyes to the table. Across from him, Vanessa was still speaking, but he could not hear a single word. For the first time in 3 years, he realized that the greatest investment he had ever received was never the company Danielle helped him build. It was Danielle herself, and he had been foolish enough to let her go. The memory refused to let Ryan go. Sitting only a few feet away from Danielle, he could almost feel himself being pulled backward into the night when everything they had built together quietly fell apart. His business had finally begun attracting important investors, and one of the largest firms in Manhattan had invited him to an exclusive celebration at a luxury hotel overlooking the city. Danielle spent hours preparing for the evening, not because she cared about expensive people or elegant parties, but because she was proud of him. She wore a simple dark blue dress she had owned for years and fastened a pair of small silver earrings that had belonged to her mother. When she looked in the mirror, she smiled to herself, hoping Ryan would see the same woman who had stood beside him through every difficult season. At first, everything felt perfect. Ryan introduced her to several clients, and Danielle greeted each person with kindness and quiet confidence. She listened more than she spoke, remembered names, and somehow made complete strangers feel comfortable. More than one guest told Ryan that his wife was wonderful. But as the evening continued, another woman seemed to appear everywhere he turned. Vanessa Collins wore an expensive designer gown and carried herself with the effortless confidence of someone who had always belonged in rooms like this. She laughed at Ryan's jokes, complimented his business ideas, and spoke about investment opportunities that Danielle had never cared to understand. Ryan did not notice the way Danielle slowly became quieter. He did not notice that she spent more time standing alone near the windows overlooking Manhattan. He only noticed that influential people seemed impressed by Vanessa. As the orchestra played softly, one of Ryan's business partners walked over and smiled. "So which one is your wife?" The question lasted only a second, but Ryan hesitated. Danielle looked at him, waiting for him to laugh and place his arm around her like he always had. Instead, he looked toward Vanessa. "Life changes," he said quietly. "Sometimes people grow in different directions." Danielle felt as though the room had suddenly become very cold. The partner looked confused before politely walking away. Vanessa remained silent, but the small smile on her face said enough. Ryan finally turned toward Danielle. "Can we talk?" She nodded and followed him onto the outdoor terrace where the city lights stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. The wind moved softly through her hair as she waited for him to speak. Ryan took a long breath. "I do not think we fit together anymore." Danielle looked at him without anger. "What are you saying?" He lowered his eyes. "My life is changing. The people I work with, the places I have to go. You deserve someone who belongs in your world, and I need someone who understands mine." Danielle stood perfectly still. She remembered the nights she worked extra shifts. She remembered selling her grandmother's necklace so his company could survive. She remembered every promise they had made to each other inside their little apartment above the bakery. None of those memories seemed to exist for him anymore. Slowly, she reached for her wedding ring. Ryan watched her hands, but he did not stop her. She slipped the ring from her finger and placed it gently into his palm. There were no tears, no shouting, no desperate words. She simply looked at the man she had loved with all her heart and said, "I hope one day you find what you think you are looking for." Then she turned and walked back through the ballroom alone. The orchestra continued playing. Guests continued laughing. The world did not stop for a broken heart. Sitting inside the Crystal Garden restaurant 3 years later, Ryan unconsciously reached for his left hand. The wedding ring was gone, but somehow the weight of that quiet goodbye still remained. Across the room, Danielle looked happier than he had ever seen her, and for the first time he understood that she had not lost everything that night. He had. Danielle never told anyone where she went after leaving the hotel that night. She walked through the quiet streets of Manhattan until the bright lights disappeared behind her and the city finally grew silent. The little apartment above the bakery was still waiting for her, exactly as she had left it that morning. Ryan's coffee mug sat beside the sink. A stack of unopened business magazines rested on the kitchen table. Their wedding photograph still stood on the bookshelf, showing two young people smiling as though nothing in the world could ever separate them. Danielle stood in front of the picture for a long moment before gently placing it inside a drawer. She did not break the frame. She did not throw it away. Some memories deserved kindness, even when they brought pain. The next few months were harder than anyone around her realized. Friends called, but she rarely answered. Neighbors asked where Ryan had gone, and she simply smiled and said that life sometimes took people in different directions. During the day, she continued working at the bookstore. In the evenings, she volunteered at a neighborhood literacy program, helping children and older adults learn to read. She discovered that listening to other people's stories made it easier to survive her own. One afternoon, the director of a local nonprofit organization approached her after class. "You have a gift," the older woman said. Danielle looked surprised. "For what?" The woman smiled. "You make people feel seen." A few weeks later, Danielle accepted a position helping organize community outreach programs across Brooklyn. The salary was small, but for the first time in years, she woke up excited about the day ahead. She visited schools, food banks, and neighborhood centers, quietly helping families who had been forgotten by the rest of the city. The work was not glamorous, but it filled the empty places inside her heart. Little by little, she stopped thinking about the life she had lost and started building one of her own. Seasons passed. The old apartment above the bakery became too full of memories, so she moved into a small place near the community center where she worked. She painted the walls a soft cream color, filled the windows with flowers, and covered one shelf with books and framed photographs of her parents. Her wedding picture never returned. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, Danielle found the tiny notes she had once written for Ryan. "Believe in yourself. You are closer than you think." She read them quietly and smiled. The words had always been meant for someone she loved, but somehow they had become the message she needed herself. She folded the notes carefully and placed them inside a small wooden box beside her mother's silver earrings. She was not carrying the past anymore. She was honoring it. Back inside the Crystal Garden restaurant, Ryan looked at Danielle and realized that the sadness he expected to see was completely gone. The woman sitting beside Alexander Hayes was not pretending to be strong. She had become strong. There was a quiet confidence in the way she spoke to the waiter, the way she thanked the musicians after they finished a song, and the way she smiled at strangers without expecting anything in return. Vanessa noticed the expression on Ryan's face and slowly lowered her fork. You are still thinking about her, are you not? Ryan looked down at the untouched meal in front of him. He remembered the woman who had once waited for him with dinner in a tiny apartment above a bakery. He remembered the handwritten notes and the sacrifices she never mentioned. Most of all, he remembered that she had walked away without anger, giving him exactly what he thought he wanted. Across the room, Danielle laughed softly at something Alexander had said, and Ryan finally understood that she had not spent the last 3 years waiting for someone to save her. She had quietly saved herself. Long before the night at the Crystal Garden restaurant, Alexander Hayes had never expected that a quiet afternoon in Brooklyn would change the direction of his life. His foundation had organized a charity event to support literacy programs across the city, and dozens of volunteers had gathered inside a small neighborhood community center. Reporters followed him everywhere he went, expecting photographs and carefully prepared speeches, but Alexander had never cared much for attention. He preferred to arrive early, help arrange tables, and leave before anyone noticed. That afternoon, however, someone else had arrived before everyone. Danielle stood near the entrance carrying stacks of books in her arms while greeting children by name as they walked through the doors. She wore a simple cream-colored sweater and dark jeans, nothing like the elegant women Alexander usually met at business dinners. Yet there was something about the way she listened when people spoke that immediately caught his attention. An elderly volunteer accidentally dropped a box of donated books onto the floor. Before anyone else reacted, Danielle knelt beside her, helping gather every book while asking if she was hurt. A little boy who had been standing nearby looked worried because one of the books had torn slightly. Danielle smiled at him and said, "Stories are a little like people. A small tear does not make them any less valuable." The child smiled again, and Alexander quietly found himself smiling too. Throughout the afternoon, he watched Danielle move from one person to another, never seeking recognition. She organized supplies, served lunch, and sat beside an older man who struggled to read a simple sentence, encouraging him with the same patience she showed the children. When the event finally ended, Alexander walked over and thanked her for volunteering. Danielle looked surprised when she recognized him. "You are Mr. Hayes." Alexander nodded. "And you are the reason today was successful." She laughed softly and shook her head. "No, today was successful because people decided to help each other." The answer stayed with him long after he returned to Manhattan. Over the following months, their paths crossed again through different charity projects. Sometimes they spent hours packing school supplies. Sometimes they visited neighborhood shelters together. Alexander noticed that Danielle never spoke about her past unless someone asked, and even then she never blamed anyone for what had happened. One evening, after a fundraiser had ended, they sat outside the community center watching the sunset color the old brick buildings with shades of gold. Alexander asked her a simple question. "After everything life has taken from you, how do you still trust people?" Danielle looked toward the children playing across the street before answering. "Because if someone else chooses to stop loving with kindness, I do not have to make the same choice." Alexander had built companies worth billions of dollars, but he had never heard anything so quietly powerful. Back inside the Crystal Garden restaurant, Ryan watched Alexander speak to Danielle with complete attention, as though the rest of the world had disappeared. There was no pride in the billionaire's eyes, no desire to impress anyone, only respect. Vanessa slowly looked between them and then back at Ryan. "She seems happy." Ryan lowered his eyes to the untouched plate in front of him. He remembered the countless times Danielle had tried to share simple moments with him while he rushed toward the next business opportunity. He had mistaken kindness for weakness and loyalty for something ordinary. Across the room, Alexander reached for Danielle's hand as the musicians began playing a quiet melody, and Ryan realized that another man had seen the treasure he had once held without ever understanding its value. The waiter quietly placed another bottle of sparkling water on Ryan's table, but neither he nor Vanessa seemed to notice. Across the restaurant, Danielle and Alexander looked completely at ease, speaking softly as though they were the only two people in the room. Ryan had spent the last 3 years convincing himself that the divorce had been necessary, that some sacrifices were simply the price of success. Yet every memory that returned made that belief harder to hold. Vanessa reached across the table and touched his hand. "You have barely said a word since they arrived." Ryan forced a small smile. "I am fine." She looked toward Danielle, and then back at him. Are you? He did not answer. At the table across the room, Alexander noticed that Danielle had become quieter. She had seen Ryan the moment she entered, even if she had never admitted it. She slowly folded the napkin in her lap and looked out through the tall windows where the lights of Manhattan reflected across the river. Alexander followed her gaze. Do you want to leave? Danielle smiled gently and shook her head. No, you do not owe anyone your comfort. She looked back at him. I am not uncomfortable. There was a peaceful certainty in her voice that surprised even herself. 3 years ago, seeing Ryan with another woman would have shattered her heart. Tonight, she simply felt grateful that life had continued after the pain. Alexander leaned back slightly. You know, the first time I met you, I thought you were the strongest person I had ever known. Danielle laughed softly. That is because you did not know my story. I know enough, he answered. Strong people are not the ones who never get hurt. They are the ones who refuse to become cruel after they do. Danielle lowered her eyes for a moment. No one had ever described her that way before. Across the room, Ryan watched Alexander speaking to her with complete attention, and something inside him quietly broke. He remembered all the evenings Danielle had tried to tell him about her day while he checked emails during dinner. He remembered how often she had asked him to take a simple walk with her after work, and how many times he had answered that he was too busy. The opportunities he had ignored had become someone else's greatest privilege. Vanessa slowly withdrew her hand. Do you still love her? Ryan stared at the tablecloth in front of him. The question felt impossible because the answer had never disappeared. He had simply buried it beneath ambition, pride, and the illusion that success could replace everything else. Finally, he spoke. I do not know if I ever stopped. Vanessa looked at him quietly. There was no anger in her expression, only sadness. She realized that she had spent years trying to compete with a memory that had never truly left his heart. At that moment, a little girl from another table accidentally dropped her stuffed rabbit onto the floor near Danielle's chair. Before anyone else moved, Danielle picked it up, knelt beside the child, and brushed a little dust from its ear before handing it back with a warm smile. The little girl hugged the toy and thanked her. Her parents smiled gratefully. It was such a small moment that most people in the restaurant barely noticed. Alexander did. Ryan did too. He remembered another rainy afternoon years ago when Danielle had repaired a broken toy for a neighbor's son because his family could not afford a new one. She had always been exactly the same. The world around her had changed, but her heart never had. Alexander looked at Danielle with quiet admiration and gently reached for her hand. She did not pull away. Ryan watched their fingers meet across the table, and for the first time he understood that fate was giving him one final lesson. Some people leave your life because they stop loving you. Others leave because you forget how to love them back. The musicians near the center of the restaurant began playing a slow piano melody, and for a brief moment the entire room seemed wrapped in a quiet kind of peace. Danielle looked toward the small stage, listening to the music with a gentle smile that Ryan remembered better than his own reflection. Years ago, she used to hum softly while making breakfast in their little apartment above the bakery. She had always believed that ordinary moments were the ones people carried with them forever. Alexander noticed the distant look in her eyes. What are you thinking about? Danielle smiled and looked at him. That life is strange. Sometimes the places where you think your heart was broken become the places where it finally heals. Alexander nodded as though he understood exactly what she meant. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small velvet box. He did not open it right away. Instead, he looked at Danielle with the same quiet respect he had shown her from the very beginning. Across the room, Ryan saw the movement and felt his heart begin to race. Vanessa followed his eyes and slowly realized what was happening. The conversations around them continued, but somehow the distance between the two tables felt smaller than ever. Alexander took a slow breath. Danielle, I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who admired success. You are the first person I have ever met who reminded me that kindness matters more. Danielle looked at the small box in his hand, but remained silent. He continued speaking. You never asked me for anything. You never cared about my name or my company. You simply made the people around you feel important, and somewhere along the way, you changed my life too. Several nearby guests had begun to notice. The music softened even more as Alexander stood from his chair. Ryan could not move. Every memory of the woman he had once loved seemed to gather inside him all at once. He remembered the handwritten notes beside his coffee, the rainy afternoons, the little apartment, the night she placed her wedding ring into his hand without anger. Danielle slowly stood as well. Her eyes shimmered under the warm restaurant lights, but there were no tears, only quiet surprise. Alexander opened the velvet box. Inside rested a simple, elegant ring, beautiful without being extravagant. He smiled gently. I know that you do not need anyone to rescue you. You already found your own strength long before I came into your life. But if you will allow me, I would be honored to spend the rest of my days walking beside you. The restaurant grew completely silent. Waiters stopped moving. Conversations faded. Even the musicians seemed to pause. Ryan looked across the room and realized that the entire city could disappear around him, and he would still only see Danielle standing there. Vanessa quietly lowered her eyes. She understood that she was watching the ending of a story that had started long before she ever arrived. Alexander held out the ring. Danielle Brooks, will you let me build a future with you? Danielle looked down at the ring for a moment before lifting her eyes to his. She saw not a billionaire, not a famous businessman, but a man who had always treated her heart with care. She reached out and gently took his hand. Across the room, Ryan unconsciously stood from his chair as though some part of him still believed he could stop time. But time had already moved forward. Danielle smiled the same quiet smile she had once given him years ago, and in that single moment Ryan understood that some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. If you fail to protect them, they become someone else's miracle. For a few quiet seconds, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Danielle stood before Alexander, her hand resting gently in his, while the small ring caught the warm light from the chandeliers above them. She looked into his eyes and saw the same kindness that had followed her through every community event, every quiet conversation, and every moment when she had doubted whether happiness would ever find her again. Slowly, she smiled. It was not the uncertain smile of the young woman who had once stood on a hotel terrace watching her marriage fall apart. It was the smile of someone who had survived the hardest season of her life and discovered that broken things could become beautiful again. Danielle nodded softly. Yes, she whispered. Alexander closed his eyes for the briefest moment, almost as though he had been holding his breath too. He carefully slipped the ring onto her finger, and gentle applause began to spread through the restaurant. One table joined another, until the entire room was filled with the sound of strangers celebrating a moment that somehow felt larger than two people. The musicians began playing again, and even the waiters smiled as they continued their work. Across the room, Ryan remained standing beside his chair. He watched the ring settle onto Danielle's hand and realized that the promise he had once broken had now become someone else's future. Vanessa looked at him quietly. She no longer seemed upset or jealous. Instead, there was a quiet understanding in her expression. She reached for her purse and slowly stood. Ryan finally looked at her. Where are you going? She offered him a small, sad smile. I think I finally understand that I was never the woman you were trying to find. Ryan lowered his eyes. He wanted to say something, but no words came. Vanessa gently touched his shoulder. She was not ordinary, Ryan. She was simply too good for someone who could not see her. Then she turned and walked toward the exit without looking back. Ryan remained alone at the table. The expensive dinner in front of him had grown cold. The business contract he had celebrated earlier that evening suddenly felt meaningless. Across the room, Danielle was thanking the people who had applauded. She spoke to the musicians. She smiled at the waitstaff. She even bent down to wave at the little girl with the stuffed rabbit. Success had never changed her. Pain had never made her bitter. She was still the same woman who had once written little notes beside his coffee every morning. The only difference was that someone else now understood her worth. Alexander noticed Ryan standing alone. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the restaurant. There was no anger between them, no challenge, no victory. Alexander simply gave a small respectful nod before turning back to Danielle. That simple gesture somehow hurt Ryan more than any harsh words ever could. It reminded him that real strength did not need to humiliate anyone. Danielle followed Alexander's gaze and saw Ryan for the first time that evening. Their eyes met across the distance. 3 years earlier, she had imagined that if this moment ever came, she would want him to feel the same pain she once carried. Instead, she felt only peace. She offered him a small, gentle smile, The kind of smile someone gives to an old chapter that helped shape the rest of the story. Then she quietly turned back toward Alexander. Ryan slowly sat down again as the tears he had refused to shed years before finally filled his eyes. He understood now that losing money could be repaired. A career could be rebuilt. But losing the one person who believed in you before the world did was a kind of poverty that no amount of success could ever erase. The evening slowly came to an end, and one by one the guests began leaving the Crystal Garden restaurant, carrying with them the memory of a moment they would probably tell their families about for years. Outside, Manhattan shimmered beneath a sky filled with stars and city lights, the streets alive with taxis and quiet conversations drifting through the warm night air. Alexander and Danielle stepped out together, leaving behind the music, the applause, and the part of her life that had finally found its ending. For a moment, they stood on the marble steps outside the restaurant without speaking. Danielle looked down at the ring resting gently on her hand. It was beautiful, but what mattered most to her was not the diamond or the elegance of its design. It was the promise behind it. Alexander noticed the tears shining softly in her eyes. "Are you happy?" he asked. Danielle smiled, and this time the smile reached every part of her face. "I think I forgot what happiness felt like for a while." Alexander took her hand carefully. "Then we will make sure you never have to forget again." Across the large windows of the restaurant, Ryan remained seated at his table. Most of the guests had already gone home. The candles had burned lower, and the musicians had packed away their instruments. He looked through the glass and watched Danielle walk toward the future he had once promised to give her. Years ago, she had stood beside him with the same quiet faith, believing that together they could build a beautiful life. She had given him loyalty when he had nothing. She had believed in him before anyone else did. And when he had broken her heart, she had left without trying to destroy his. Ryan slowly reached into his wallet and unfolded a small piece of paper that had somehow survived all those years. The edges were worn, and the ink had faded slightly, but he recognized the handwriting immediately. "Believe in yourself. You are closer than you think." One of Danielle's old morning notes. He could not remember why he had kept it, but now he understood. Some part of him had always known that the best part of his life had been the woman who wrote those words. A waiter approached quietly and asked if he needed anything else. Ryan looked down at the note before folding it carefully and placing it back inside his wallet. "No," he answered softly. "I had everything I needed once." Outside, Alexander and Danielle walked slowly along the sidewalk. The city around them felt different somehow, quieter and kinder than before. They passed a small flower stand preparing to close for the evening. An elderly florist smiled at them and handed Danielle a single white rose. "A gift," she said. Danielle thanked her, and as they continued walking, she gently held the flower in one hand and Alexander's hand in the other. She realized that life had never truly taken everything away from her. It had simply cleared a path towards something she could not yet see. Alexander stopped beside the river where the lights of Manhattan danced across the water. "Do you know what I admire most about you?" he asked. Danielle looked at him curiously. He smiled. "You never allowed pain to change the kind of person you were." Danielle looked out across the city and thought about the little apartment above the bakery, the handwritten notes, the nights she cried alone, and the long journey back to herself. Then she looked at the man standing beside her. "Maybe life was never trying to break me," she whispered. "Maybe it was teaching me where I truly belonged." Together they walked into the quiet glow of the city lights, leaving behind regret, betrayal, and the weight of yesterday. And somewhere behind them, a man who had mistaken kindness for something ordinary finally learned that the greatest treasures in life are often the ones people only recognize after they are gone.